via the House of Commons website. The webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. In order to facilitate the work of our interpreters and ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. First, interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. In order to resolve sound issues, please ensure that you are on the English channel when speaking English and on the French channel when speaking French. And I would specifically ask for the witnesses to take note of that. If you plan to alternate from one language to the other, please also switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you are speaking. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, please click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Same rules with respect to points of order for members. If you have a point of order, please indicate so by unmuting your mic and identifying yourself. If you wish to speak on a point of order that has been raised by someone else, please use the raise hand function. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When not speaking, your mic should be on mute. As you've heard during the sound check, the use of headsets is strongly encouraged. If you have a microphone on your headset that hangs down, please make sure it's not rubbing on your shirt while you are speaking. If any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation, or if you're accidentally disconnected, please advise the chair or clerk immediately and the technical team will work to resolve them. Please note that we may need to suspend during these times as we need to ensure that all members are able to participate fully. So before we get started, can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure that they are in gallery view. With this view, you'll be able to see all of the participants in a grid view, and it will ensure that all video participants see one another. So with that, by way of preliminaries, I would now like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. From the Foreign Agriculture Resource Management Services, FARMS, we have Ken Forth, President. From International Longevity Centre of Canada, we have Margaret Gillis, President, and Kiran Raberu, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Chair of the Board. And from the Migrant Workers Centre, we have Juliana Daly, Staff Lawyer. I understand that our witnesses have some opening remarks. Mr. Forth, please proceed. You have the floor for 10 minutes.
Oh, point of order, Chair, before we begin, please.
Yes, Ms. Cusey.
Thank you so much. It just wouldn't be one of our meetings if I didn't start with a point of order, Chair. Just a quick note that certainly while we understand the Minister for Seniors has a very busy schedule and we appreciate her correspondence, we are, of course, very disappointed that she couldn't be here today. We've had all of the other ministers appear before us and we're eager and anxious to see her as well. And so I would ask, please, that you continue to work to get here as soon as possible, Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
We'll do so, and we've been assured that your disappointment won't last long. So we'll continue to persist.
And just on that note, the House of Commons is a point of information, and I guess a point of order, asked for us to respond as quickly as possible. And in doing so, we have to be a cabinet and have to be in front of the policy processes as parliamentary secretaries as well as cabinet ministers. And that's what's delaying her appearance in front of the committee, is she's trying to respond to the House's request to get the legislation and the relief package for seniors prepared as quickly as possible, and doesn't want to miss another day doing that. So she will be attending as soon as she can, but she also takes the charge from the House of Commons very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Forth. You have the floor for 10 minutes, sir. Please go ahead. Need to unmute your mic, Mr. Forth. Okay, we're going to move to Ms. Gillis from, Ms. Gillis from the International Longevity Centre for Canada, and we'll come back to Mr. Forth once we get the technical issues resolved. So 10 minutes for the International Longevity Centre Canada.
Thank you very much, and I'm hoping you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. I'm Margaret Gillis, President of International Longevity Centre Canada, which I'm going to refer to as ILC Canada. It's an organization that advocates for the human rights of older people, and we are part of a 16-country global alliance and are partnered with the Life Research Institute at the University of Ottawa. Attending with me today is Dr. Kieran Raburu, Chair of the Board of ILC Canada. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Ottawa and a geriatric psychiatrist at the Ottawa Hospital. We are here today to study our government's response to COVID-19 pandemic. Like many Canadians, I am grateful for the unprecedented teamwork we have seen across party lines here in Parliament and between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, placing the needs of Canadians before partisan and jurisdictional politics. We are also grateful to have HUMA pause to reflect and seek some initial views on Canadians in response to the COVID-19 crisis. However, this is but a first step in what we believe should be a longer process. We all know that older people have been the most severely impacted group worldwide in this crisis. We know that the rights and contributions of older people are often overlooked both in politics and in practice. Canada needs to take a leadership role in rectifying the horrible treatment of seniors during the pandemic through, among other actions, the sponsorship of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, which would work towards ensuring that older persons' rights are not ignored. While it is vital to be vigilant right now, it's premature to think that narrowly focusing on Canada's response in the middle of an evolving crisis will provide us with a full assessment. There will be a need for meaningful and lasting change, and it is like trying probably to build an airplane in mid-flight. So we need to continue this and keep it going. We will need a comprehensive process to identify lessons learned, and this process must involve looking at all aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. We're talking here about prevention, preparedness, response, where we are now, and recovery. The challenges we are facing, as illustrated by the systemic problems in long-term care, the rise in elder abuse, and the patronizing ageist attitudes towards older people in the press and in our society, have become more visible and urgent during the pandemic. We must embrace this unprecedented reality and boldly move forward to support human rights. We must be jointly accountable for results for Canadians. Instead of pointing fingers, we must all own part of the situation and move quickly to fix it. We were encouraged by the words of Prime Minister Trudeau when he said, "We need to do better because we are failing our parents, our grandparents, and our elders, the greatest generation that built this country. We need to care for them properly." Indeed, we do need to do better, and we must find a way forward that reinstates and reinforces Canadian values. It is time to be bold. It is time to embrace the new post-COVID-19 era. Canadians want answers, Canadians need leadership, and Canadians must demand accountability for seniors. Time is everything, and the stars are aligned at this moment for Canada to make a difference. I would like to use today's discussion to advance ways we can strengthen the rights of older persons to ensure that their lives, health, and well-being are not overlooked during and after the pandemic. As I mentioned, there is no comprehensive binding international human rights convention for older persons as currently exists for women, children, and persons with disabilities. ILC firmly believes that a binding international convention would provide stronger protection for older persons, protections which have been so lacking during the pandemic. We should discuss how a convention could help by examining two important examples of rights, the right to health and the right to affordable, accessible, long-term care. Think for a moment about what we've seen in the last few weeks. Older people left to die in their beds without medical assistance, dealing with a virus that results in tremendous suffering, or older people dying of dehydration, malnutrition, or being left in filthy beds. How can this cruel and unthinkable treatment be happening in Canada? And who can forget the images of family members standing outside long-term care facilities, hoping to get a glimpse of a loved one whom they have not heard about for days, only to hear that they have been abandoned and left to die unaided in this most horrific manner? Is Canada a country that leaves its most vulnerable to die? A country that has left a system so incapable of handling a crisis that it has to rely on the army to rescue vulnerable people? Where are the human rights of those people? Ask yourself also, if we would allow this to happen in our schools, our daycare, our hospitals, or any other institution. There's a very basic lesson here, and is that human rights cannot be an afterthought in a pandemic or ever. Human rights need to be front and center in all that we do. According to the latest data, 79% of the deaths in Canada during the pandemic have occurred in long-term care. We need to call this for what it is, a human rights violation, which is reflective of systemic ageism and the devaluing of importance and contributions of older Canadians. While we can all claim to be saddened over the loss of lives, not many of us can say we are surprised by what's taken place. You would have to be living in a bubble to miss the multiple reports of abuse in long-term care. The blind 94-year-old woman locked for 2 weeks in a room full of bed bugs, the sickening murder of 8 residents in Ontario, would have gone on had the murderer not told her pastor, or the multiple reports of choking, beatings, and neglect that have, in some cases, led to death. All these clear human rights abuses took place before the pandemic. The treatment of older people in Canada is nothing less than a failure of human rights in our own backyard. It is heartbreaking to see how frontline workers have struggled in the most impossible of situations. We need to take steps now to ensure that never happens again. ILC Canada encourages the Canadian government and all parliamentarians to work together to protect the rights of older citizens by leading the movement for a convention on the rights of older persons. Acting in this manner would go a long way to reestablishing our reputation as a country that values the lives of all citizens. Why? Because a convention would see older persons as rights holders. It would combat ageism. It would allow the public to hold governments accountable for human rights abuses by giving them access to the UN Human Rights Council, and it would educate the public and empower older persons. A convention would also help to promote and protect the rights and dignity of older persons. The impact of the pandemic has made it crystal clear that only policies and mechanisms currently in place are inadequate and insufficient from a human rights perspective. Such actions have had a severe impact on the lives of older people. We have all observed the changes in attitudes towards people with disabilities and the actions taken by countries that have resulted from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I'm assuming this committee is very familiar with. We are certain that a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons would have the same positive influence and impact. We call on Canada to lead the convention in order to foster a better understanding of the scope and meaning of human rights for all people. This move would be in keeping with the long, proud history Canada has in protecting rights at the United Nations. ILC Canada has been at the forefront of the movement for a UN convention. For the past 6 years, we've been working actively at the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. And in doing so, we have continually encouraged Canada to act decisively. In 2018, ILC Canada brought forward a petition to the UN to have Canada lead and support the convention. We were very encouraged when the Canadian delegate to the United Nations announced that the door was open to Canadian support. But unfortunately, there's been no movement since. So the door is open, and we're hoping that you will step through. During the pandemic, we have begun a writing campaign to Ministers Champagne and Schultz asking that Canada lead and support the convention. Our letter was tabled with the committee today. We have been successfully reaching out to other groups, and we have had momentum from public and political support, including from prominent Canadians, such as Major General Louis McKenzie, whose letter of support I've also provided to the committee. We see the opportunity to speak to all of you today as a great sign that there is an openness to make the needed changes to better the lives of older Canadians. We sincerely and steadfastly hope you will support our call to defend human rights for older Canadians. And finally, honorable members of HUMA, I would like to leave you with 3 key takeaways. Number 1, Canada needs to grow and learn from the treatment of seniors in this pandemic. We need to bring about profound and substantive change to such treatment because there is no best before date for human rights. They begin at birth and they end at death. Secondly, Canada needs to lead the development of the United Nations Convention on Older Persons. This convention is about fundamental human rights. It is in perfect alignment with our Canadian values, which we all hold deeply. And lastly, time is of the essence. We can't afford to wait to do the right thing for the human rights of older Canadians. We need to act now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis. Mr. Forth, you have the floor for 10 minutes, sir. Please go ahead. You just need to unmute your mic there, Mr. Forth. There you go. You're all set.
You okay?
It's good.
You hear me? Okay. Thank you, Chair, and to the HUMA committee. Thank you for asking me to appear today. First of all, I'll tell you who I am. My name's Ken Forth. I'm a vegetable farmer in Hamilton, Ontario. Our family's been farming for many generations. Currently, it's my son's and my family and my son's family. I also serve as president of the Farms Operation, the Foreign Agriculture Resource Management Service. We do the administration and logistics for the movement of 25 to 30,000 workers to Ontario, Atlantic Canada, and Manitoba. Fruit and vegetable business is very much a hands-on business. As an example, we've been employing people for over 100 years on our farms. Our farmers being involved in the SOP program, the Seasonal Agriculture Worker Program, for 50 years, having workers from Jamaica. The workers that work on our farms mean the world to us, much like family. They come here to help farmers and, for that matter, help Canada to produce food. The result of their work is that they are a better standard of living back home, including the education of their children. The virus that has engulfed the world is most concerning to everyone, and I can assure you that all farmers take this very seriously. There is much oversight on our program for the virus, including Service Canada, provincial ministries of labor, and the real experts, the local public health officials and departments. The ESDC came out with protocol just after the April 20th announcement, and the protocol was satisfactory. It was common sense, and it worked for everybody. Most of us have been inspected and scrutinized many times this season, and through the various protocols. Our employees are very pleased with what they have seen and what they have heard and what we're doing on our farms. Let me be clear. We are very concerned. Our employees remain safe, foreign or domestic. How else could we think? We isolate new temporary workers for 14 days. When working, we stay apart as much as we can. When there is any way that we will be any closer, workers wear masks, glasses, or face shields. Farmers have gone to extraordinary lengths, not to mention thousands of dollars, to give confidence to our workers that it is safe. Farmers are very inventive, often going beyond what is required. As an example, many placing barriers in bunkhouses and on farm equipment to ensure a safe working environment. In closing, the requirements by the Government of Canada, provinces, and local health officials should all be proud of the protocol that they put in place in a very short order, and the farm community who responded to it. But a final word of caution. This has been very paralyzing for farmers. We have done the things demanded by us and beyond. If we think we can even do better, we do that. But we have 5 agencies scrutinizing us now. Any further scrutiny or add-ons will drive farmers away from this industry. Some already have left, and make the jobs impossible, the job of production of food for Canada. What we really need is we've seen the federal government, as an example, have the back of landlords, multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. We'd like them to have the back of farmers the odd time, and we think we need it now. But we are all for all the security methods that they have put in place to isolate our workers. As an example, for on our farms, our workers never leave the farm. They never leave it, and they don't want to leave it. They tell me they come here to work. They don't want to get infected at a shopping mall or whatever. They put orders into the local grocery store. The local grocery store has the order ready every Friday, and we pick it up and deliver it to them, and they're very grateful for that. And so we believe they're pretty safe, really safe, and we believe that farmers are doing a better job than they're being given credit for. That's my presentation to you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Forth, and thank you for being so concise. Next, we have from the Migrant Workers Center, Juliana Daly. You have the floor for 10 minutes. Ms. Daly, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Juliana Daly, and I am a staff lawyer with the Migrant Workers Center. I'm joining you from Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I will be speaking to you today about the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on some of the most vulnerable workers in Canada, migrant and undocumented workers. I'm representing the Migrant Workers Center, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver that is dedicated to legal advocacy for migrant workers. Established in 1986, MWC facilitates access to justice for migrant workers. We provide free legal advice and representation to over 1,000 migrant workers each year. We also provide public legal education and do law and policy reform and test case litigation. Hundreds of thousands of migrant and undocumented workers across the country work in our grocery stores as cleaners, care workers, truckers, farm workers, and in many other occupations. These workers are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. Migrant workers grow the food that we eat and make sure that it reaches our shelves. They build our homes, schools, and workplaces and keep these spaces clean and safe. They take care of our children, the elderly, those who are sick, and those with disabilities. They are some of the heroes that we've been applauding every day. The COVID-19 crisis has shown how essential these frontline heroes truly are. It has demonstrated the level to which our society depends on migrant workers to perform these low-wage jobs. Yet, migrant workers are uniquely vulnerable to abuse and exploitation in their employment. Many of them have no means of becoming permanent residents of Canada, as their work is not considered by the government to be skilled enough. The structure of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program renders migrant workers vulnerable to abuse. This is important to understanding the impacts of COVID-19 on migrant workers. In order to apply for a work permit, a temporary foreign worker must first secure a job offer, employment contract, and approved labor market impact assessment, or LMIA, from a Canadian employer. This process can at times take up to a year. Workers must then apply for a work permit from Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC. The work permit they receive only authorizes them to work for that single employer in that single job in that single location. If the worker loses their job, they have to start the process all over again. It's important to note that migrant workers cannot perform any work to support themselves or their families while waiting for a new work permit to be approved. If they begin working before their work permit is approved, they risk arrest, detention, and removal from Canada. This system makes migrant workers uniquely vulnerable. They are unable to speak up about abuse in the workplace or unsafe working conditions for fear of losing their job. Undocumented workers face similar challenges. Many have contributed to the Canadian economy for years, filling labor shortages by working in low-wage and dangerous jobs that are undesirable to Canadians. Yet, their lapsed immigration status makes them vulnerable to abuse. In addition, they have limited or no access to workers' compensation or publicly funded health care. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these vulnerabilities. At the Migrant Workers Center, we have seen our clients impacted by COVID-19 in numerous ways. For workers in essential services, including farm workers, they are at a heightened risk of exposure to COVID-19. We have all seen the tragic reports of outbreaks at farms, nurseries, and meat processing plants. Many of these workers are migrant or undocumented workers. They are putting their lives on the line so that we can eat. Many of them are afraid to go to work, but they cannot speak up. Particularly for farm workers, many of them work in conditions that few Canadians would tolerate. The guidelines published by Employment and Social Development Canada for employing migrant workers during the COVID-19 crisis, in our opinion, do not go far enough to protect these vulnerable workers. I will return to this point later in my remarks. On the other hand, many migrant workers are at risk of becoming undocumented because of the COVID-19 crisis. More temporary foreign workers are losing their jobs, and they can't work because they have employer-specific work permits. These workers want to work. We have clients who are healthcare workers who want to be on the front lines of this crisis, but they can't. We have clients who want to work on the farms, but they can't if they lack the proper work authorization. Temporary foreign workers who lose their jobs can't renew their work permits easily because they can't secure a new LMIA. Again, the process for applying for LMIAs is complex, long, and costly, and many employers are unwilling to go through it, particularly in light of the uncertainty that we face due to COVID-19. If a migrant worker has lost their job due to COVID-19 and still has status, they can apply for the CERB. But if their work permit expires and they lose status in Canada, they will become ineligible for the CERB. If they lose their status, they're in an impossible situation. They can't work to support their families, they can't apply for EI without status, they can't apply for CERB without a SIN number, and they can't leave Canada due to travel restrictions and closed borders. We have had workers in this situation approach our office, and we have had to tell them that there are no viable legal options for them to work and renew their status or for income support. We estimate that there are tens of thousands of migrant workers across Canada whose permits may have expired or be expiring since the COVID-19 crisis began. These workers will lose their status through no fault of their own, without changes. This will result in many people becoming undocumented. At the same time, we know that employers, particularly in the food supply chain, are facing labor shortages as a result of the crisis. There are solutions. The Government of Canada has the tools to provide relief to the hundreds of thousands of migrant workers in Canada. I'll now turn to our recommendations. First, issue open work permits to workers during the COVID-19 crisis. Granting open or unrestricted work permits will allow workers to continue working or return to work in available jobs and to maintain their status in Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic. IRCC should automatically renew work permits to an open work permit during this time, or restore workers to an open work permit if they've already lost their status. Workers with secure status may be less afraid to come forward and report symptoms or speak up about health and safety concerns in their workplaces. This will reduce the spread of COVID-19. In addition, we know that employers are in desperate need of workers, yet fewer workers are arriving in Canada. Granting open work permits will allow migrant workers who are already here in Canada and who may have lost their jobs to fill these labor shortages quickly and efficiently. This will benefit everyone. Second, we recommend that ESDC improve its compliance system to prevent abuse of low-wage migrant workers and reinstate in-person inspections. ESDC has a mandate to ensure that employers comply with the regulations imposed on them for hiring migrant workers. However, ESDC has stated that it will not be doing in-person inspections as a result of COVID-19. In our view, this is unacceptable. It is possible and necessary for ESDC to do in-person and unannounced inspections with appropriate safety precautions. This is a matter of life and death for workers. ESDC has a duty to ensure that workers are kept safe during this pandemic. With no in-person inspections to ensure that employers are complying with the guidelines for hiring temporary foreign workers during COVID-19, we will have a growing public health crisis on our hands. We have seen dozens of cases in our office prior to the pandemic where workers bravely decided to come forward and report abuse to ESDC only for their complaints to go nowhere. This cannot happen during this crisis. Migrant Workers Centre has endorsed recommendations for improvements to ESDC's guidelines, and we would be happy to share these with the committee. Third, we recommend that a new permanent residency program for migrant and undocumented workers be created. Even though they are performing essential work that we depend on, many migrant workers, such as seasonal agricultural workers, cleaners, or grocery store clerks, have no way of becoming permanent residents of Canada. They should be allowed to apply for permanent resident status. If they have lost their status, they should be able to regularize it by applying for an open work permit. For too long, Canada has relied on migrant workers as a disposable workforce. This needs to change. If migrant workers are good enough to work in Canada, they're good enough to stay as permanent residents. MWC has written to Prime Minister Trudeau and Immigration Minister Mendicino calling on the government to make these changes. And finally, we recommend that undocumented workers be allowed to access the CERB. During the pandemic, every worker in Canada should have equal access to CERB. The CERB should be open to people with an expired SIN, or the government can issue a temporary SIN to anyone who applies by suspending the requirement to prove one's status in Canada in order to apply. This will allow undocumented workers to access the financial support that they need and deserve during this crisis. These are our recommendations for the Canadian government to both respect and value undocumented and migrant workers during this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Right on time. We'll now proceed with rounds of questions, beginning with the Conservatives. Ms. Cusey, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gillis, thank you so much for joining us here today. I was actually dumbfounded by the article in the Globe and Mail and your words, human rights don't have a best before date. Unfortunately, it's the second time we've seen a question of human rights in the handling of this pandemic by this Liberal government. What they've attempted to do frequently is to pass things such as care and long-term facilities onto their provincial counterparts. But you have mentioned in the media the lack of uniform standards for seniors' care at the federal level leaves older Canadians vulnerable to both elder abuse and tragedies like the COVID-19 pandemic. Would you like to elaborate on this, and how you wish to see additional oversight from the federal government?
I think the issue that's happening, for instance, to begin with, using the example of long-term care, is a perfect example where we need federal leadership as well as working together with the provinces and the territories. I think there has to be quite a reckoning around long-term care as a result of what we've seen during the pandemic. And I think it's really important that something very quickly be struck, perhaps a committee that involves FPT folks along with experts in the area of long-term care. And I think we really have to look at this from beginning to end. This problem is not simply a case of dealing with long-term care. We have to look at the whole continuum of care, starting with the issue of home care, how that impacts long-term care, and how that impacts the hospital systems. All of those things are connected. And if we don't look at them together, we won't have a proper solution. And part of that is the federal role with respect to the Canada Health Act. And part of that work would probably have to involve looking at how we can be more effective and even efficient, even in terms of funding. So I think it's a really important area where we all have to work together at all levels of government.
Thank you for that. Specific to this, in your opinion, has COVID-19 testing in long-term care facilities been sufficient? And what could the federal government have done to improve testing in these centers?
But I think we know there was an issue at the front end of this pandemic in terms of testing. So testing has to be a lesson learned from this. And I think, however, we can support the long-term care industry to do that is extremely important. I may just flip that one over to my colleague, Dr. Ribeiro, who is in the front lines. So if you don't mind, can I send that over to Dr. Ribeiro?
Certainly.
Stephanie, thank you very much for the question. I just want to set the stage that, while this COVID pandemic has really opened up the wounds or the scabs, shall we say, within our system, we need to go to 40,000 feet and start with who are we talking about? If you look around you, and I know there's no one sitting with you, if there was a person sitting next to you, then 1 out of the 3 of you will have dementia by the time you're 80 years of age. Okay. So, and if you think it's not going to be you, then you're in massive denial. It can be anyone. And we all know people who have it. Secondly, we're all getting older, and ageism is very insidious, and we are all subject to it, 100% of us. So we're not talking about someone outside, someone who's from somewhere else about a virus. It is part of our society. Now, the COVID-19 has just unmasked some of those symptoms that have always been there. And beyond the physical impact of the virus, there's been a substantial increase in non-COVID related issues as well, such as social isolation, the mental and physical disability, mortality, and morbidity associated with it. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done once the pandemic starts to settle. But I think we really need to look at how can we make our system such that we don't ever have to subject our parents, our grandparents, or ourselves in a few years to go through this again. We must do something about this now.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Now, in addition to that, provincial governments have increased protections for seniors in long-term care homes throughout the pandemic by limiting visitors, providing staff with personal protective equipment, and preventing employees from working at multiple homes. Of course, we saw a delay in the closure of borders. Here in my hometown of Calgary, the Premier actually had to go to the local airport himself to check out local screening, which was not being implemented by the federal government in good enough time. Should the federal government have intervened so that these steps were taken earlier, Ms. Gillis, or Ms. Gillis?
Okay, I think this has been a very interesting and unusual pandemic in the sense that this virus has acted so differently than other viruses. And so I believe the government was following the advice at the time. I think we have learned since then that there are many asymptomatic persons who are spreading virus, which is quite different from what had happened in the past. Again, I think this is a really important lesson learned. And I think that probably is a lesson learned all over the world, not just here in Canada. I think everyone was caught off by that, but I hope we never will again.
Well, myself as well. Should the federal government do you think, have provided greater assistance to ensure all long-term care facilities had enough personal protective equipment at the start of the pandemic, in your opinion?
Short answer, please.
While they do fall under provincial responsibility, I think it's the point we were making broadly that this really needs to be looked at across all levels of government. It has to be looked at also in conjunction with what the federal government does, and I think in the context also of looking at the Canada Health Act. So
thank you, Ms. QC.
Moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis. Thank you, Dr. Weber.
Thank you both. Now to Mr. Long for the Liberals for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses and to all of my colleagues. First and foremost, I want to reject the assertion of my colleague who just asked questions that, as a federal government, we aren't stepping up. I absolutely reject that. We are stepping up. The last time I checked, we have Canadian forces in Quebec. We have Canadian forces in Ontario. And this is not a partisan issue, not one bit. This challenge with respect to seniors has been unfolding really over decades. So I just want to put that on the table. And look, I think we all know the challenges that, seniors' homes are facing. Ms. Gillis, to your point, 79% of all deaths in Canada are related to long-term facilities. And we know we have a major challenge there. So here's my question to you, Ms. Gillis. Seniors are significantly less likely to have access to critical social supports, including always having people they can depend on in times of need. Social supports are critical during the COVID-19 crisis as seniors need to self-isolate and are relying on family, friends, and neighbors to deliver groceries, medications, and other essential items. So please, what does the federal government need to do in the short term and the long term to ensure that low-income seniors are getting the support they need during this period?
Well, I guess looking at it from my perspective, which is as a human rights advocate, I think those are basic rights. The right to have access to the fundamentals of living. I think we do have those programs in place in terms of old age security and other issues. I think what's going to come out of the pandemic, however, is some of the points Dr. Ribeiro mentioned, which is in terms of the impact of social isolation and the ability for older people to get access to a lot of things you just mentioned there in terms of groceries, particularly when they're socially isolated. I think those are some of the lessons that are going to be learned from the pandemic, and we're going to have to look at that. But we do have those issues in place.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to share the rest of my time with MP Vaughan. Thank you very much.
Vaughan, please.
Well, thanks very much. Just a quick follow-up on the questions around seniors. The issue of private care and public care has been at the heart of many of the challenges we faced. I was curious as to what you thought about allowing more and more private care into the space and less regulation of private care.
I think that's one of the problems that we're facing right now, and I think it's one of the pieces that we're really going to have to examine as we go forward. I think once we start to get all the evidence together about where these real human rights abuses took place, and what has happened there. I think that's going to be part of how we respond to this. So again, kind of the point, we're in the middle of it. We need to be gathering that data right now, and then we'll be able to respond.
I just want to read a quick comment and get your reaction to it.
Sure.
There was a health minister who once said, unlike some of our predecessors in Ottawa who often tried to impose rigid bureaucratic healthcare conformity on the provinces, we have respected constitutional jurisdiction over healthcare and encouraged their innovations. This was Stephen Harper's last health minister. Is that perspective part of what's led to some of the catastrophic failure? The fact that the federal government should step away and only respect provincial jurisdiction and hide behind the Constitution?
Well, I'm not a big fan of hiding behind the Constitution, and I think this is a time where we all have to work together, and I think that was part of my opening comments. It's very important for the provinces to work with the federal government to look at this.
And so you'd accept a federal rule that might step on provincial jurisdiction but made it safer for seniors?
I probably wouldn't say step on, but yes,
okay.
I agree.
And then a final question.
Think of the Jordan Principle, where we had to protect a child, where we ran into the same issue, where there was differences in provinces and territories and the fighting between the federal government.
I have limited time, so I've got one question for Mr. Forth from Farms Canada. The notion that just anybody sort of can come from one of the countries that we draw foreign workers from for our farm sector, these are skilled workers. There has been a position advanced by some in Parliament that effectively you could just put students in the farm fields and the plants would get planted, the crops would be planted and the crops get harvested. The workers you choose from Trinidad or Jamaica or the Eastern Caribbean or from Mexico, you would classify them as skilled workers?
Yes, I would. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You're absolutely right. And we don't choose them. The ministries of labor in those countries choose them. And usually they have to be a farm orientation of one thing or another. There's a difference of, they talk about putting students, and lots of us hire lots of students, but our year starts on April 1st if we're outside growers, and it ends on November the 15th. I think school is on in most of that time period. And we would be desperate without this program. These guys actually like doing what they do. They really do. They really like doing what they do. And they do it at home, and they do it here, and they learn a lot here, and they take it home. And to think that they're abused, my gosh, I mean, these are part of my family and always have been for 50 years. And I've had people working here for over 35 years straight before they retired. Like they really are skilled workers because they like to do what they do. And what they do is not tough work. On our farm, there's not a lot of there's no heavy lifting. There's none of that stuff. They just love to produce this stuff, and it works really, really well.
And so you would support us.
Thank you, Mr. Forth, and thank you, Mr. Vaughan. That's your time. Madame Chabot, vous la parole pour 6 minutes.
You have the floor, Madame Chabot. 6 minutes. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the sound good? Yes, it's perfect. Oh, good. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to our 3 witnesses. I would like to come back to the issue of our older persons, our senior citizens. Of course, what we have seen with COVID-19 in each of our provinces, everybody wonders how that could be. There has to be a review of what occurred to better care for older people. But excuse me, Madame Chabot. I received a note from the interpreters asking you to speak more close to your microphone. Closer to your microphone. Yes, like that? Yes, that's good. Well, as I was saying, there are all kinds of considerations. Was mistreatment? Was there evil intent? Were they not properly cared for in these instances? But as to elders' rights for older people, you spoke to the financial precariousness of older people's situations. The Bloc Québécois is very much interested in that. What is your opinion?
Question is, am I concerned about the financial precariousness of older people? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, of course we are. I think we're very also worried about older people and their access to and their impact of them financially during the COVID-19 piece. So I think that's another area that we'll have to be watching to make sure that that funding, did get through to older people. But generally, we know that older women tend to be the ones who live in poverty in our country. And older women are, the larger majority of older people. So, we are always supportive of ways in which that's being watched and taken care of. So thank you for your question.
Merci.
Thank you. I too am not in agreement with respect to certain levels of competency that and jurisdiction that could be attributed here in Ottawa. I believe that the responsibility lies with the provinces. Each province should be able to establish its own needs, and the health transfers are there to allow the provinces to act in that way. Now, for the Migrant Workers Association representative, my question is for you. I thank you for your explanation of the problem that is caused for migrant workers. We know that in all areas, agricultural areas, there are some difficulties. But what is the proportion of foreign workers that come here? How does it work in this level of agriculture? How can it be facilitated?
Thank you for the question. So I understand that you're wondering how many workers come and how the process can be better facilitated. To my knowledge, there are tens of thousands of farm agricultural workers who come to Canada each year across Canada. And in terms of the precise process, there are numerous programs that people can arrive under. I believe the largest proportion come under the seasonal agricultural worker program that we have heard about from Mr. Forth. These workers come for a short period of time, usually up to 8 months per year, and then they return to their home countries at the end of the season. And as Mr. Forth said, many of these workers have been coming to Canada for many, many, many years. And I do appreciate that for some, they may not have experienced abuse, and that is great.
Je peux peut-être préciser ma question.
Perhaps I could go into more detail in my question. I can try to be more specific. You know, in Quebec, we have about 15,000 foreign workers in the agricultural area. That's about half for those workers in Quebec. So how can you go beyond in terms of welcoming these persons? How can you improve their situation?
Recommending is that workers be granted access to permanent residency in Canada. This would allow them to remain in Canada and have the same rights and benefits that we as Canadians expect. They would have the option to change employers if they are experiencing abusive working conditions. And this secure status would give them a greater ability to speak up about abusive working conditions. It would allow them to be with their families in Canada, and because many of these workers are separated from their families for many, many months of the year. And overall, this is something that we need to do because of COVID-19, but also, you know, beyond COVID-19, we rely on these workers in this workforce, and this may in fact lead to a more secure workforce for the future in Canada if these workers are permitted to stay.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madame Chabot.
Ms. Kwan, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I'd like to first start off with a question for Ms. Daly. On the question around migrant workers and undocumented individuals, one of the issues, of course, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, some of them may have lost their jobs, they may have lost their status because the timing of which is such that those two things literally collapse together at the same time frame. And if you lose your job and your work permit expires, you cannot renew because your employer-specific status will not allow you to renew. So to that end, do you think that the government should, one way to deal with it, the government can in fact allow for people who have an expired SIN number to collect CERB? Is that something that you would recommend?
Certainly, we would recommend that people with expired SIN numbers be able to access benefits. For many, these workers have been working in Canada. They've been contributing to the labour market. And like many other Canadians, they are in this unprecedented crisis and having lost their jobs. They deserve access to the same income supports that others can access. And so allowing workers with expired SIN numbers or allowing people to apply for a temporary SIN number without proof of status are measures that we would recommend. We would also recommend that people be able to apply for open work permits, which would also facilitate access to both income support, but even more so, it would allow people to return to the labor force and actually work in some of these jobs where there are labor shortages. So we would recommend both of those measures.
Thank you. In fact, one of the issues for people who have a work permit that's going to expire is that the IRCC is experiencing difficulties in processing. And so hence there are delays. And as a result, people are really left out in the cold. And would you recommend for IRCC to actually automatically extend people's work permit during this period, and in fact to open it up from a employer-specific work permit to an open work permit?
We would recommend that measure. This would be an efficient and timely way of allowing workers to maintain their status and return to work as quickly as possible. The problem, as you've alluded to, is that when a worker is waiting for a change in work permit conditions or an extension of their work permit to process, they cannot work for anyone other than the employer listed on their work permit. And if they've lost that job, they have no way of supporting themselves and their families. And so allowing workers to access open work permits, including by automatically renewing expiring work permits to open work permits, would be a quick and efficient way for those workers to return to work in available jobs, maintain their status in Canada, and continue to work and support themselves.
Thank you very much. Just one last quick question on this topic. For undocumented workers, another way for the government to ensure that they're staying safe and not just for themselves, but in the spirit of flattening the curve for everyone else as well. What about the government utilizing the ITN numbers so that people can get financial support during this difficult period?
I think we would support the government making that financial support available to workers, both undocumented and documented workers, by any means necessary. So if it's simpler for the government to use the ITN, we don't see an issue with that, as long as workers can access the financial support that they deserve.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to turn to seniors now for a minute. We know that with the care facility, part of the issue is that there is no standardized, no national standards, if you will, in long-term care facilities. That happened in BC as well, where there were a lot of privatized long-term care facilities took place, and people were forced to work in unsafe conditions and sometimes in multiple facilities. So I think, quick question on that. Ms. Gillis, I think I heard you say that we need to actually have national standards for long-term care facilities across the country. Did I hear you correctly on that?
I think that's an absolutely excellent idea. You're hearing me okay? Yes. And I think all of these issues, all of the questions you have asked me really link back to the issue of rights and doing what's right and what people need. And national standards is one great example. But I'm going to go back to the point that I think, honestly, we need to start thinking about older people in a whole different way. We need to address ageism, and that comes out in all of the ways that long-term care has been handled, the defunding of it, the problems with workers. It's all connected. So I would take it back to, let's get a convention. Let's treat these people as rights holders, and let's make everybody think before they make decisions on seniors that lead to problems like we've seen today.
Thank you. Before my time runs out, in the interim, we have a situation where a lot of seniors are very worried about their GIS, even though the deadline to file income taxes has been moved to the end of June, but it remains that people may not be able to get their taxes filed in time. During this period, would you agree, or would you suggest that government should simply grandfather people for this year for their GIS so that they would not be penalized if they don't get their income taxes filed in time?
Short answer, please.
I don't have a lot of knowledge on the GIS in terms of the whole process, but here's what I'm going to say. I think whatever we can do to help seniors, particularly those living in poverty, we need to assist them in every way that we can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis, and thank you, Ms. Kwan. That completes our first round. I want to offer a sincere thank you to all of the witnesses for being with us. Your testimony has been extremely helpful. We're now going to suspend briefly while we do a mic check for the second panel of witnesses. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and MPs will be back shortly. We're suspended. Dr. Jennifer Robson from Carleton University. Et enfin,
And lastly, we have the Mouvement autonome et solidaire des sans-emploi, Mr. Sylvain Lafrenière, who is the coordinator of that movement.
With your opening remarks, Dr. Preston, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. To start, I would like to thank you for inviting me to provide comments and suggestions to this committee. A rally cry of the disability rights movement is the saying, nothing about us without us. And consultations such as this are an important part of giving voice to a population that historically has been spoken for rather than collaborated with. My name is Jeff Preston. I'm an assistant professor of disability studies at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee.
Chairman? Yes, Ms. Shabbat? I don't have any interpretation, Chair.
Est-ce qu'on peut régler?
Can we perhaps clear up this problem that Madame Shabbat is having?
C'était pareil pour moi aussi.
It was the same thing for me too.
Okay. Est-ce qu'on peut?
Can we hear the interpreters and the technicians? Have the technicians been able to identify the problem?
I believe we're almost there.
Hi, we're good in the room now. It should be fine.
Okay, Madame Shabbat, Monsieur.
Madame Shabbat, Monsieur Lafrenière, can you hear now? Is it working?
Bien, Monsieur.
Mr. Preston hasn't spoken, so I really can't say. Mr. Preston, go.
Preston, the floor is yours. Yeah. Sorry for the interruption.
No, not a problem. So as I was saying, my name is Jeff Preston. I am an assistant professor of disability studies at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. My research and teaching practice at King's seeks to excavate the cultural construction of disabled subjects in the ways that popular culture and policy frameworks naturalize and reinforce sane, masculine, and able-bodied supremacy. I'm also a person born with a physical impairment, a rare form of muscular dystrophy, who identifies proudly as a disabled person and have used an electric wheelchair since early childhood to make trouble in our world. While the global COVID-19 pandemic has only recently been recognized as a world-altering event in need of critical resource and policy redeployment, the virus has been on my mind since spreading beyond the borders of China. COVID-19 represents a unique, exigent, and existential threat for someone like myself with muscular dystrophy, a disease that most often proves fatal due to pneumonia. With lungs that function at approximately 30%, it is unlikely that I would survive this virus. It's for this reason that I've been attempting to live in relative isolation since early March. But this attempt has proven uniquely challenging, given the fact that I cannot physically live independently. Significant reduction to muscle mass means that I cannot provide for myself the day-to-day requirements of life, from eating to hygiene to repositioning at night. All of these things require daily care routines, tasks that are all delivered in close proximity. My PSWs, funded through the self-directed funding program in Ontario, drift in and out of my orbit throughout the day. Many of my PSWs are reliant on public transit, as low wages can make personal vehicle ownership a luxury out of reach after covering the costs of living. At any moment, my staff could accidentally bring the virus into my home. And because of PPE and sanitizer shortages, I have struggled to erect adequate barriers between myself and the outside world. At times, the infection, me catching the infection, seems like an inevitability. Aside from the obvious physical and viral challenges of COVID-19, a nagging terror felt by myself and many of my friends with impairments revolves around whether or not care will be delivered should we become infected. As the primary fear of imminent death slowly burns away, I, like many others with underlying medical conditions, now fear that the illness is not the only thing that may end our lives during this pandemic. Failing support systems may be just as deadly. For someone like me, the COVID-19 pandemic draws into focus the feeble and unwinding threads of socio-medical entanglements that struggle at the best of times to carry the weight of my disabled existence. Access to technicians able to service my adaptive devices from my electric wheelchair to my cough assist machine becomes fraught in a world of social distancing. Early in the pandemic, the ADP program, the Assistive Devices program in Ontario, that funds the purchase and repair of these equipments, was deemed non-essential and shuttered. If I catch the virus, workplace safety standards will require all of my staff to wear non-existent PPE to continue to safely deliver care in home. If I'm hospitalized, strict visitation restrictions mean that I will lose access to my support team, becoming fully dependent on overworked nurses to provide the near 24/7 care that I cannot do for myself. As we heard several weeks ago in British Columbia, in the case of Eris Knight, admission to hospital can mean a profound isolation, cut off not just from social contact, but from the delivery of necessary hour-to-hour care that keeps me safe from a whole host of other comorbid threats to body and mind. We are told that depending on our ability to flatten the curve, that hard decisions will need to be made about who can and cannot be saved. We may be asked to debate the value of a person to determine how productive or survivable one must be to merit receiving care. Those most at risk, disabled people, seniors, are now facing the cultural and legal pressures of necropolitics, asked to sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of those deemed more valuable. While we may have vilified the word eugenics after the Second World War, the ideology remains alive and well in Canada, lurking under the auspices of triage and the way of nature. In the here and now, what do disabled people in Canada urgently need? The answer to that question is absolutely massive, but I do have several recommendations derived from my own experience and from those who I am in contact with. First, I think it is vitally important in overt and unequivocal opposition to eugenic rationalities that the Canadian government affirm the rights of Canadians with disabilities to fair and equal access to medical care and prohibit any type of value or quality of life-based triaging of medical equipment or supplies. These types of policies, I believe, are antithetical to the spirit of the open, diverse, and caring country that we have tried to build over the past century. Remember, without disabled Canadians, the world would not have marathons of hope, a newscaster turned lieutenant governor, or the Back to the Future trilogy. We must also ensure that once a vaccine is developed, that distribution is prioritized to those most in need, such as frontline workers, those with underlying conditions, and not just on economic or productive value. To ensure the safe isolation for those in need of in-home care, easy and affordable access to personal protective equipment is critical, including masks, gloves, and alcohol-based sanitation supplies. We also need to consider increasing funding support for the types of increased care that may be needed in this time, as some tasks that were previously able to be done independently may now require help from the outside. I believe that we need to validate in-home care staff and family caregivers as vital members of an individual's healthcare team, not as a social visitor, who can provide important additional support in a time when our hospitals struggle with capacity issues. We must secure our long-term care facilities to prevent the spread of the virus from unit to unit and from facility to facility. Supporting provincial efforts to care for the caregivers is critical, including increasing PSW staffing numbers and providing regular paid time off for recharging of batteries or fighting off sickness. Scaling up the number of people working in these roles, I believe, is critical. This also means, though, a re-examination of past practice where we warehouse disabled people of all ages in medical facilities, not because they need medical care, but because of a lack of affordable, accessible housing. We need to ensure access for those seeking cognitive, intellectual, and emotional therapies or services for pre-existing or newly developing mental illness or distress. Many of these services were deemed non-essential in the early days of the pandemic, with hospital resources being redeployed elsewhere. But it is important for us to get these services back online quickly for those who really do depend on these services and programs. I think we also should reflect, though, on the federal government's determination that those without work need about $2,000 a month, plus up to $1,000 in earning to weather the storm. Meanwhile, programs like ODSP in Ontario have long expected disabled people to subsist on a little over $1,000 a month. Why is the cost to live for those with and without disabilities presumed to be so different? What does this tell us about the fairness of these programs that are aimed to provide a life for those unable to labor in a physically or attitudinally inaccessible economy? Now, when I was young, I loved to play with Lego. Not the really building part, I wasn't very good at that, but I was really good at tearing things apart. There's something really special or magical about those moments, not just the wanton destruction, but because of what it signals. That in the ruins of the destroyed project lay the building blocks of the next great edifice. In confronting this threat, we need to ask ourselves not just how we survive today, but how we will live with ourselves once it has passed. COVID-19 may mean that the world that we knew several months ago is gone, but maybe that isn't all bad news. What if in post-COVID Canada, we spent more time enabling people rather than disabling them? What if we reimagine our healthcare systems to be ones of plenty and not austerity? What if the flexible and digital work arrangements currently offered to non-disabled employees were extended permanently for employees with disabilities who have long been asking for this type of access? What if we provided Canadians with the things they needed to thrive, regardless of their cognitive or physical ability? I look forward to imagining some of these possibilities with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Preston. Dr. Robson, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to join you today. I'm Jennifer Robson, an associate professor of political management at Carleton University. To try to minimize some of the technical problems that I've been aware of in recent meetings, I am going to deliver my remarks today in English only. I do apologize in advance, particularly to Madame Chabot and Monsieur Lafrenière, but I just know that I will make a mess of things if I try to think about what I'm saying and click different languages back and forth. So I do apologize. My remarks today are informed by my research on Canadian social policy and by the countless inquiries that I've received from Canadians about the emergency income supports during the pandemic. Members of the committee may be aware that since March 25th, I've been regularly updating a plain language summary of income benefits. In fact, I just posted an update to that before beginning the testimony today. Finally, I'm also speaking as a mom of 3 who has, like millions of parents, been trying to figure out how to juggle full-time work and homeschooling at the same time. So I've previously described the economic shutdown due to COVID as a medically induced coma. As a country, we might be slowly starting to come out of that coma, but we're still not able to do much without some kind of life support. As we regain consciousness, there are some important truths that we need to grapple with. COVID-19 hasn't hit all Canadians equally. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I see that yours highlighted. I'll pause.
No, you can go right ahead, Dr. Robson.
Okay, thank you. So COVID-19 hasn't hit all Canadians equally, whether in health or economic effects. I'm going to focus on 4 different kinds of inequalities that have mattered in the crisis and will continue to matter during the economic reopening and eventual rebuilding. These are, first, inequalities in information and technical capabilities. There's been uneven information and help for individual Canadians to understand and use government benefits. At the same time, it's been evident that government has not always had adequate data or IT systems to be able to launch or adapt programs as policymakers or the public might want. Second inequality is the inequality in the financial resources that households have to self-insure against an income interruption and the inevitable need to wait even a short time for government help. 3, as impact work. There are people whose work has been largely immune to the shutdown. There are workers who were suddenly deemed essential. Too many Canadians who suddenly lost all or most of their paid work. And then there are those whose pre-COVID unemployment has been significantly prolonged. And finally, 4, inequalities in the responsibility for unpaid care and unequal opportunities to fully participate in the economic reopening and eventual rebuilding. So let me add a little more detail and offer some recommendations to the committee. The Government of Canada does not have enough information about Canadians or the computer systems to be able to design and deliver income supports in a way that can nimbly handle big month-over-month changes in employment and income. The fact that the back-end system that runs EI was able to ramp up from processing an average of 5 claims a minute to processing 1,000 a minute is nothing short of a public administration miracle, I will say that. And as you heard from the Deputy Minister himself, there is much we cannot do as fast as we should or even at all because our IT systems cannot handle rapid changes or fine-grained exceptions to general rules. And while many have touted a national basic income as the right answer, the fact is there is no magic list of Canadians to be able to find and send a check to everyone, let alone whatever Canadians, who will meet the eligibility criteria that Parliament might set. So I hope that this committee might support a plan to invest significantly and for the long term in the back-end capacity of government so that we're better placed to prepare not only just for the next macro shock, but also to address the wide range of needs of Canadians who experience micro shocks all the time. Too many Canadians find government programs confusing. They are confusing. Online, frequently asked questions and call centers are no substitute for personalized guidance and help. I don't have to tell you, as MPs, how important it is that Canadians have access to local, accessible, and accurate help to use government programs. You and your constituency teams have been playing a vital role in connecting people to the help that they need, but you can't do it all. No one network could. We need to build a properly resourced web of nonprofit, so not fee-for-service, services to answer questions, problem solve, and advocate for clients who can't do it themselves. And here I would encourage the committee to look into the Citizens Advice Bureaus in the United Kingdom or Financial Empowerment Centers in the United States as sources of inspiration. Many Canadians are going to continue to need income support for the next while, and they will need active measures to get them back into the workforce. We have to hope that the emergency wage subsidy will mean that some share of layoffs won't become permanent. But many sectors that were hardest hit in job losses, sectors like accommodation and food services, retail trade, education services, are also lower down the list for reopening in provincial plans. We want to incentivize work, but work that is safe to do. The emergency programs like CERB are going to have to be wound down gradually and likely morphed into more nimble designs that can handle a wider range of cases. This is going to be hard to do, in large part because of the same gaps in federal data and IT that I mentioned a moment ago. So work should also be underway now with provinces to adapt and expand active measures in employment programs so that they can be more effective, handle increased demand, and work within the constraints imposed by social distancing, which is likely to continue for some time. 1/3 of Canadians came into this crisis without enough liquid savings to pay for even a poverty line standard of living for 1 month, let alone keeping themselves at their usual level of consumption. A bit of additional liquidity in the form of mortgage and tax deferrals will have helped some. But part of the rebuilding phase is going to have to be rebuilding household finances. And I hope that members of this committee will work with colleagues on the Finance Committee and others to find better tools to help households reduce debt and build emergency savings. Finally, too many families with kids are going to face awful and unreasonable choices during the reopening as they continue to juggle unpaid care and returning to paid work or a job search. By best estimates, 2/3 of the lost employment in March, and we'll get updates on Friday, in terms of both lost hours of paid work as well as jobs, were among women. But it is moms who lost the most paid work, more than other women without kids, and more than dads. Provinces are taking a range of approaches in reopening, but it increasingly looks as though most elementary schools will not be able to reopen until September. Childcare services that were already unable to meet demand pre-crisis won't be able to operate at full capacity for some time to come. And I worry about the potential loss of childcare spaces as operators lose revenue and lay off staff. I worry about mothers being left out of work or job hunting, even as governments lift public health restrictions. And I worry what will happen to household finances if, on average, 40% of earned income in the family vanishes because mom has to stay home with the kids. This isn't a private problem for families to solve. That's a macroeconomic disaster waiting to happen. With provincial agreement, federal support should be directed to protecting existing childcare spaces when current revenues put a centre's viability at risk. We should also increase the number of childcare programs that can work within provincial health guidelines so that parents, and moms in particular, can participate in the economic reopening and eventual recovery. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chair, you are muted again.
Oh, merci, je m'excuse.
Oh, I apologize. Thank you. Now, we have the Mouvement Autonome et Solidaire des Sans-Emploi, and Mr. Sylvain Lafrenière is going to be speaking for the next 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, members of Parliament. I'm very happy to follow on Ms. Robson. I'm going to begin directly. I'm speaking on behalf of the Mouvement Autonome et Solidaire des Emplois, which brings together some 15 organizations in Quebec that are spread over the majority of the administrative regions of the province. The majority of the issues that we deal with are employment insurance based, but we also deal with income security and health and safety in the workplace. Our services provide individual support in the court instances. We provide information on legislation, information workshops and training workshops as pertains to laws and general representation. I'm involved in this area. With respect to our network now, we are for the implementation of an employment insurance regime that is fair and universal. I have to say that the program, as it stands now, has considerably been diminished over the years since the 1990s, but it needs to be substantially improved. And although there have been improvements since, but nonetheless, there is a rate of unemployment that is relatively low and has been low for several years. At the beginning of this crisis, we were quite concerned about the government's ability to react when it announced the stay-at-home measures that were so necessary. MAS began to make representations concerning unusual delays with respect to the processing of benefits applications. The time frame moved from 28 days. The 28-day time frame, rather, was exceeded, sometimes by quite a lot, and we knew that this would be a problem in quite a number of files. We therefore asked that there would be a processing of the files that would be a little more quick at or about March 15th. And we are still wondering if we have been forgotten in this area. Well, with respect to this, the CERB is something that has probably been the most efficient and effective measure that has been announced, particularly in our view.
Total value of $1.38 million. That.
Excusez, j'ai pas.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what's going on. What's happening? I didn't understand either. I think there's a problem here, Chair. Yes, quite so, a problem. Has that problem been corrected?
Oui, pour moi, c'est bon.
Yes, I think so. Do you have a point of order?
Yes, Chair. I can see it's already 3:38 p.m. Pacific time, and all three of these witnesses are excellent. And I want to ask the permission of all committee members if we can extend our meeting to ensure 2 rounds of questioning to respect all of the witnesses who came forward today. Thank you.
I think that question should also probably be extended to the House of Commons folks. There are significant demands on our resources. Can we have Mr. Lafreniere complete his statement, and then that will give the House of Commons folks time to figure out whether that's possible, and then I'll come back to your point of order. Is that okay, Mr. Viss?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Mr. Lafreniere,
You can continue, Mr. Lafreniere. Thank you very much. I was saying, particularly with respect to the CERB, we were very appreciative. There was an effort made to simplify the procedures and to set in place an eligibility criterion that dealt with the $5,000 limit, which would allow for the participation of part-time workers. That is to say, they would be able to be eligible for the program. That wasn't the case in the past. So that addition of these part-time workers or self-employed workers was very important. It also allowed for aid for self-employed workers, which represent some 15% of the workforce in Canada. They did not have any eligibility for EI in the past, but with this tweaking, it is better for them. I want to say that in the area of EI, we do feel that there should be further improvements made, something that we feel strongly about. It was not always done in the past. Well, we do, though, have to note some minor problems, particularly with respect to the issue of voluntary departures, which is not allowed under the terms of the Act right now. There are certain conditions that exist, and one of them that is health, safety. If that were threatened, there could be a voluntary departure. These are the exceptions. And there are benefits that would be made available for workers. I know that it's not the same everywhere in Canada, but in Quebec, we have started to deconfine, to loosen the stay-at-home order. And that has an undue effect. It could have an undue effect on certain workers, particularly concerning the restrictions that exist as to the measures that are set in place by the employers, their salary conditions. We're quite happy with the broadening of CERB. This is something that is very good for seasonal workers and also all those people who have suffered significant financial loss, or even some of their normal income has been lost. This is something that is certainly is good because in certain areas the employment market has more or less collapsed. Those persons were to be added to the initial program, but there was a great deal of uncertainty in the population that was created, and they felt that seasonal workers should be added. In addition, something more troubling is the implementation of the CESB. It is a debate that was held, there were many people who wondered why some people weren't taken into account. Some $1,200 is the baseline in Quebec for certain positions, certain jobs. But during that seasonal period, you have some university students that wanted to be able to take advantage of making some money to be able to finish their studies. And some felt that there would be a disincentive to people who would hesitate to seek work if they had this money available. In Mass, we have always sought regulations that would clarify gray areas. We still don't know if there is any type of a remedy that is available to settle problems that people experience concerning CERB. We want to find solutions to any problem. We are disappointed by the closing of service bureaus of Service Canada throughout the country, particularly since the unemployed who are most likely to turn towards Service Canada are those who are the most vulnerable. They have limited access to the internet, and there are people who maybe are older and who don't understand the technology as they should. So this is an unfairness that exists. I would like to end by saying that we are disappointed by a lack of communication that in respect of the government. We know that the situation was very urgent, that decisions had to be made very quickly. We understand that. But we do hope that in future, as things continue on, that over the months, that there will be better communication, because we feel that there will be a recession, and it's going to be a tough recession, a deep one. And therefore, better communication with the civil society would certainly help. I end by thanking you for the invitation on my own behalf and on behalf of my group and the people that it represents. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much. Mr. Lafrenière.
We are about 14 minutes from the end of our scheduled time with Mr. Viss' point of order. If we were to do a full round of questions, that would take us about 10 minutes past that time. I don't think that's unreasonable, and I have the assurance of the staff that they're okay with that. I guess I welcome your comments, but 2 full rounds would take us about 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes past, which I think is bordering on unreasonable, but I'm in the committee's hands. My suggestion is that we do 1 round, which is 6 minutes for each party, and that we wrap up after that. Very well, then. I think I see a few thumbs up on the screen. We will start with 6 minutes. Mr. Albus for the Conservatives. You have the floor, Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your expertise and being in front of this committee today. I'd like to start with my line of questioning directed with Dr. Robson. Dr. Robson, one topic I have repeatedly canvassed here at this committee is the tragic case of pregnant women being denied the CERB by Service Canada. The minister has pledged to fix this, and you argue that it is a IT problem. Our systems are antiquated and plans to fix them are years out. Could you speak about this issue a little bit, please?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Alice. So my understanding is that the issue is that pregnant women who are applying for the CERB through Service Canada are, of course, accurately declaring that they are pregnant and then finding that they are being shuffled into maternity benefits. If I understood correctly from the testimony of the Deputy Minister last week, this is because the system, the back-end system that runs the employment insurance side of the CERB, so separate from the CRA administrated side, is not able to distinguish or to handle those exceptional cases. In normal times, it is not uncommon for women who are expectant but find themselves laid off to take a short period of or some time of regular EI benefits and then to transition on to maternity or parental benefits, sometimes with an adjustment to the number of weeks they will qualify for. I do not have a full sense, and I was not able to glean from the Deputy Minister's testimony a full sense of exactly the nature of the technical limitations. But I did note that he referred to the antiquated system of COBOL, which is older than me. So that's getting up there in years. And members may be interested, on my Twitter feed over the weekend, I posted a brief snapshot of COBOL code, which does only one thing. It prints records from one file onto a piece of paper. And it struck me that if that is the complexity of the code required to just simply print something, that creating exceptions to cases, to tell a longstanding system to do something different, to make an exception that if somebody says they are pregnant, they can still receive CERB, must be rather complicated from an IT perspective. That said, I will say I am disappointed because it struck me that this is obviously a series of cases that ought to have been expected. I have not heard similar concerns for women who have been applying through the Canada Revenue Agency. So I wonder if it might not be worth the committee's time to pursue and understand how is the back-end system different at the CRA relative to Service Canada.
Yes, and you mentioned being local and accessible, and our offices are trying to do that from all sides. We've spoken to other people who've told us that it's not a technical issue, but that they've actually been quoted the CERB legislation that actually precludes women that are expectant. And Service Canada staff has cited specific parts of the legislation to justify that. Now, the minister has said that that's not true. Do you think that this is just a failure of training, or I do know that you said that it could be the back office cobalt, but to me, we need to get an answer for these expectant mothers.
So I have read the legislation myself and in fact provided some comments to one of the first media reports that broke the story around expectant mothers. And my reading of the legislation C13 that created CERB is that it does not preclude or does not exclude women who are expectant. It does contain a provision that says you cannot simultaneously claim maternity or parental and CERB benefits at the same time, but it also does acknowledge those same benefits as contributing to the minimum $5,000 of work income in order to qualify. So it seems to me that the legislation does anticipate that there might be some workers who are in fact pregnant or have had children and may still require CERB. The reports that I have heard have included mixed messages from Service Canada personnel when they call. I think that individual Service Canada officers are no doubt trying to do their best, and that with exceptional cases, there is no doubt confusion as to what the exact rules are. And to some degree, the answer you get might depend on the time of day you call and who happens to be on duty that day.
Yes.
So that's why having clarity and having access to additional and local support to problem solve will always be important, in my view, no matter the kind of programs that government is developing.
Do you think that the fact that the CERB was able to be implemented fairly quickly and pay people just as fast shows that a half-decade timetable on fixing an antiquated system like EI is simply unacceptable?
I'm not an IT expert, so I won't be able to comment, unfortunately, on the acceptability or the accuracy of a timetable for updating software. But I do understand that there have been, and it's been reported in the media, there are several legacy systems within the Government of Canada that are mission critical in terms of delivering key employment and income supports to Canadians. And they are all in need of serious updating. It's a long-term project. And I do hope that work will be done not only to ensure that there are adequate resources, but that there's also public support to be able to sustain the project.
One thing we're doing
Dr. Robson, thank you, Mr. Albus. Mr. Viss, I see your hand raised. Do you have a point of order?
Well, it was related to the earlier point, and you missed when I raised my hand. I would just ask, maybe for those of us who aren't able to ask questions, because I did have a lot for Mr. Preston and Ms. Robson, whether we could receive their email addresses and follow up after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Viss. Next, we have from the Liberals, Ms. Young, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses today. And Dr. Preston, I'd like to talk to you and ask you a few questions if I could. And I wanted to thank you for bringing us the hard truths of this pandemic and the impact on Canadians who have disabilities. You've raised a number of issues, but I'd like to start with a very general question. How do you think the government has responded in general terms to this pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I have a lot of answers to that question. I would say right off the top, myself personally, have been very appreciative of the way in which the government had jumped into action right away, putting up messaging around social distancing and taking it seriously, not trying to carry on as business as usual. I think that was a critical step. It meant that not just was I able to shelter at home safe, but it also meant that obligations from my support workers, for instance, they also were able to keep themselves isolated. I think that was absolutely critical. I also think that the CERB is a great move in only that it is going to mean some more money in the pocket of people with disabilities, provided they have been able to work previously. This, I would say, is maybe one limitation, that there are a lot of individuals who would be on programs like ODSP that are not able to access it because they haven't earned money. They've only had their support services. The other issue that we're hearing now is that this income will be treated as income, meaning that ODSP payments in Ontario will be clawed back for those who do receive CERB. And so you're adding sort of another layer of paperwork now for people with disabilities in terms of reporting, keeping track, and actually have to kind of put the money away.
Yes. And
that's the complication.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I think it speaks to how we hope the provincial governments will decide not to claw back. In your presentation, you talked about caring for the caregivers. And last week, a motion was passed with unanimous consent that the government implement measures to provide additional support for persons with disabilities in order to assist with extraordinary expenses incurred as a result of COVID-19 and examine the best way to do this. I just wondered how you hope this additional support will help you and your PSW.
This additional support is absolutely critical, particularly for those who are using or who need staff in order to help support them. Already for myself, I'm a university professor. I'm paid well for what I do, and the costs are going up. PPE is difficult to get, and the cost of those types of things are raising really, really quickly. As was mentioned earlier, they're eating up their savings so quickly. Any sort of financial support that can help to cover some of these costs is going to get us another month further down the road safe. the more that we're able to do, the better. It also means that more funding for support for caregivers means that they're not going to be required to work in multiple facilities. This is a huge issue right now where some of my support staff, in order to make ends meet, had to work at multiple different facilities, including working in my home. That is a huge viral risk. By paying people what they need to survive, to take care of disabled Canadians, that's going to help to reduce some of that risk.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to share the remaining time I have with MP Vaughan.
Mr. Vaughan, please. We're not getting your audio, Mr. Vaughan. We can hear your household pets now.
Better? Are you getting it now?
Yes, we are.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. The Conservative
hold the mic closer, if you would, please, Mr. Vaughan.
I have birds next to me. I apologize. What percent? The Conservative government in Ontario isn't the only provincial government that's clawed back disability benefits, but would you consider that a human rights violation?
It's certainly a question. I think that when we look at the ways in which the federal government has tried to support people without disabilities versus the way that we historically have tried to help disabled people across Canada, we need to actually take a real serious look, I think, at the ways in which we are trying to provide support for people with disabilities, both during and also after the COVID pandemic.
We've also seen some Conservative commentators make the case that if we make the CERB too lucrative, that we create a disincentive for people to work. Does that hold true in the disability community?
In my experience, most of my friends that have physical, intellectual impairments, who have mental illness, they want to work. They want to be productive members of society. It's actually not that they're receiving support that they're staying home. They're staying home because workplaces are not physically or attitudinally accessible. That people see disability on a resume and you don't even get an interview.
And this time, work can be even dangerous. To Dr. Robson, then, this notion of winding down CERB as opposed to elevating it to a universal basic income, why would you recommend winding it down and phasing it out as opposed to moving to a 100% universal basic income, as some have suggested?
Thank you for the question. The policy intent of CERB was to be able to give people the economic resources to be able to stay home, right, and to do practice social distancing. And given that our employment insurance system did not have adequate coverage for all workers, and also was not able to just logistically handle the kind of demand that it saw, CERB was put in place as a temporary emergency benefit. The issue of winding down is going to be really difficult, right? And I think I alluded to that in my remarks, because what we're trying to do is think about ways that we can support workers in returning to the workforce as is safe for them. And the timing of that and the nature of the safety and the constraints they will be facing will be various and varied. Now, I've previously expressed some concerns, or at least some operational issues with regards to moving to a universal basic income, because, as I said, we don't have a magic list. We don't actually have a list that is, in fact, universal. And if we have set up a system that is as simple as possible, has been able to quickly ramp up to meet demand, it still isn't actually necessarily reaching everybody who is in need. And it isn't, as we have seen, it isn't necessarily a magic bullet, right?
Sorry, Dr. Robson, we're well past time. Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Suite, nous avons Madame.
Ms. Chabot, you have 6 minutes, please.
Yes, Ms. Cusey.
Certainly we all have different home environments we're dealing with here as we go through this difficult virtual sitting environment. But it is very hard to hear some of the questions and the responses if there is some type of other distraction in the background. And so I would just really ask that all of the members and witnesses, as far as possible, and again, as I said, this is to use an overly used term, unprecedented time here we are in, but it is very distracting, and it's very hard to hear the questioning as well as the response with any type of distraction in the background. So just a note, Chair, please, if we could please do our best where possible to have silence within our backgrounds. And I am not immune from this. I have children running in sometime. I do my best to inform my family of this, but just if we could do the best possible to limit these distractions, please.
The House of Commons issues headsets are are a big plus as well. But thank you for that point, Ms. Cusey. Madame Chabot.
6 minutes, Madame Chabot. Well, thank you very much to our three witnesses. If we had an extra hour, I would just love it. It would be certainly very interesting. My question is to Mr. Lafrenière. Thank you so much for your presentation. You evoked the difficulties and the fears that you had to face with respect to eligibility for the CERB. And also, you spoke to the closing of Service Canada. On Service Canada, I did ask the officials about that, about the problems that it caused through the internet, through telephone conversations, or in-person meetings. I'd be interested to know how you see these issues on the short term. Ms. Robson also spoke about what is to follow with respect to the CERB and the CESB. The Bloc Québécois would not support any measure that would close off these programs. I'm just interested in knowing what you see things in the future, how you see them, how they'll unfold. First of all, for Service Canada, I'm no specialist in logistics, but I do know that the centres vary in terms of area, surface area. But I think that in most of the intermediaries, there are certain needs, as I mentioned. I know it's not the same everywhere. And in fact, some people can't even access the internet. They don't have the internet at home. And so they go to community centers where they can spend an hour or two on a computer. For telephone lines, well, it's settling down, but during the first weeks, people would say that they couldn't contact anybody for the benefit by phone, but it's getting better now. Baseline, I can say it's not always been adequate. It's not been adequate for people. Now, for the groups at home, we knew that in the area of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, for example, there'd be nobody answering the phone, and so they'd have to use the internet to ask their questions or to make contact rather. It's a difficulty. People had to reorganize themselves at home because they couldn't access their workplace, and that also proved to be a difficulty. If I understood the question with respect to the student, the CESB, the student benefit, well, I would think that you could provide access for a small amount if there were proof of loss of revenue or revenue that future revenue, I think that there should be access to the CESB. As I said, the problem is this. It's their income that they need to be able to continue their studies. I didn't hear much about that. It's a dimension that exists, though. As to the follow-up, what should occur in the future, we could ask ourselves this. There are sectors, entire sectors, and here I think about the restaurant industry, that will be particularly hard hit, and other sectors that we don't necessarily think about right away, where a good part of their sales is intended for export. Will they be able to do so with their products, or will there be a backlog in their products over a long period of time? And you always have to think about the personal dimension, their staff, what type of hours will the staff get? For example, the issue of employment insurance. So we have to look closely at that, because I don't know how the government is going to be able to keep the fund rolling. But something is going to have to be done, certainly, very quickly. On what basis will something be done? It remains to be seen, but I think that you should invite people to express their thought. You have 10 seconds left, Madame Chabot. I think that it's impossible to get an answer to a question in 10 seconds. So I say thank you. Well, have I finished then? Am I finished? Well, just make a very brief comment. It's just a very brief comment, Mr. Lafrenière. You talked about a global overhaul that should be done in the area of EI. Would you agree that keeping those temporary transitory measures in place, that might help the overhaul? Madame Lafrenière, I would encourage you to ask for a written reply. We have exceeded the time limit for you. I thank you, though.
Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. My first question is for Mr. Preston. The NDP had actually wanted the government to bring forward a universal direct payment, and that way people with disabilities, people with seniors, and all sorts of people that were now trying to plug the holes and the gaps through CERB and the student program and so on would not be left out. So to that end, the government decided not to, and we have CERB. And one of the issues that in the last week with the House of Commons, we were able to get the government to support the unanimous motion, and that is to ensure that seniors and people with disabilities get benefits at this time to get them through COVID-19. So I wonder, to that end, do you have any specific recommendations as to what the government should do?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about funding specifically, I think getting money into people's hands, allowing them to be able to direct their own care, to put the money into the places that are important to them, I think is absolutely critical. I think historically, whenever governments have tried to direct care for people, have tried to direct how or what types of care they're requiring, we often fail at that because disability is simply not a monolith. So I think empowering people to be able to use the funds to get the things that they need at the time that they need them is absolutely critical. This means not just literal things like masks, gloves, but also being able to hire people to be able to go get groceries and able to go and pick up medication from the pharmacy, to do those things that we, unfortunately, many of us took for granted before this happened.
Thank you. Well, one of the things too that we've been discussing, of course, is that some provinces are clawing back some of the emergency benefits, and so we have a uncoordinated, if you will, or not approach across the country to that end, in order to make sure that the people actually get the support that they need and not be clawed back. Should we set national standards for this unprecedented situation? I know that normally we don't intervene in terms of provincial territorial jurisdictions, but there is a question that's going on in my mind in this unprecedented situation with a national pandemic. Should that be something that the federal government should be entertaining?
I guess I maybe feel safest saying this because I'm in my own home here in London, Ontario, and not in Ottawa where I can be found out. But the experience of disability in this country is radically different from province to province. Depending on what province you live in, your experience of impairment is completely different. I think in a situation like this, a global pandemic, leadership from the top, I think, is absolutely necessary. And we need to ensure that people with disabilities are not falling through the cracks, whether they are in PEI or whether they're in British Columbia.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Ms. Robson, as we head into, I guess, wanting to think about post-COVID, we're still in a situation where people are still social distancing, people are still unemployed, and I'm not quite sure actually by June that things will be back to normal, as quote unquote what normal would be in this period. And so if required, and it may well be required for the benefits to continue until such time where social distancing is not an issue, is that something that you would advocate for the government to proceed with?
Thank you for the question. I think it's going to be clear that for people who have applied for CERB and have received 4 payments in a row, that by June they will have exhausted the 16 weeks of the maximum entitlement. Some number of CERB recipients, we are hopeful, will have been rehired by an employer using the wage subsidy. There will be many others who don't, and we do need to continue to be able to provide supports for them. As I've mentioned, mothers will be particularly disadvantaged if childcare and education facilities do not reopen fully until September, we hope. They will need continued support.
Thank you. At this situation right now, my office is, we are inundated with people who are falling through the gaps. So take, for example, even for the small business community, whereby the government has tied the commercial rent subsidy to landlords. Some landlords actually don't have a mortgage. So therefore they're saying, you know what, this program doesn't work for me. Others are simply saying, I don't want to deal with the paperwork. I don't want to deal with the government. And so therefore they're not proceeding. And there's no incentive to get landlords to proceed to support the tenants with these programming. So my question is this: should the government be looking at changing the program so that the rental assistance, the commercial rental assistance, would actually go to the small business as opposed to through the landlord, and that requirement for it to be tied to a mortgage also be waived?
Again, thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, the existing program design is the result of bilateral negotiations between the federal and provincial governments because, of course, regulation of rent is provincial jurisdiction. It's a little outside of my area of expertise. I would say, if I understand correctly, there are other avenues of support that the government has put in place for small businesses. It might be interesting to know whether or not those who are unable to receive the rent supplement, the emergency rent assistance, because of the conditions or the circumstances you described, whether or not they are in fact able to access the other small business supports. And if so, is there some avenue there for providing some support?
Yeah, just going to cut in. My constituents, literally, I've got thousands of emails from people, and they're saying that they cannot. Sole proprietors, for example, are still struggling. They do not qualify for the loan. And so this will continue on. And I think that it would be in our best interest that the government help these small businesses survive this time, because if they don't, the road to recovery is going to be that much more difficult for all of us collectively, for Canada as a whole. And so I get it that.
Thank you. So we're past time. So first of all, to all of the witnesses, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for staying on. And to the support staff, the same for you for staying on. I detect some frustration over the amount of questioning time we were able to have with these witnesses. I would just like to suggest that if there's any one of them that we wish to invite back, they may be willing to come back, and that's something that might to form one of the topics that we will discuss on an informal call with representatives from each of the parties before we meet again on Friday. So with that, thank you to the witnesses. Thank you to my colleagues. Have a wonderful evening. We are adjourned.